Picture this. You're chained to a wooden bench in the belly of a massive Roman warship. The air is thick with a stench of sweat, vomit, and human waste. Your wrists are bleeding from the iron shackles that bind you to a 12-foot oar that weighs more than most men. Above you, the rhythmic pounding of a drum beats out the tempo of your survival. Miss a stroke, and the whip comes down. Collapse from exhaustion, and you're thrown overboard while still breathing. This isn't a nightmare. This was daily reality for thousands of men who became galley slaves in the Roman Empire. Tonight, we're diving deep into one of history's most brutal occupations. We'll explore how ordinary people became human engines of war, what their daily lives looked like in the cramped, disease-ridden lower decks of Roman galleys, and why this form of slavery was considered a fate worse than death. So, settle in, get comfortable, and let's journey back to ancient Rome, where the Mediterranean Sea was ruled by ships powered not by wind alone, but by the breaking backs and dying breaths of men reduced to nothing more than human machinery. Chapter 1. How ordinary people became galley slaves. The path to becoming a galley slave usually began with a single moment of catastrophic misfortune. Unlike household slaves, who might be born into servitude, galley slaves were typically made through violence, war, or crime. War prisoners, the most common route to the rowing benches, was military defeat. When Roman legions conquered a city or defeated an enemy army, the surviving soldiers didn't face honorable execution. Instead, they were evaluated like livestock. The strongest men, typically between the ages of 16 and 35, were separated from the others. Roman military commanders had specific criteria for selecting galley slaves. They looked for broad shoulders, muscular arms, and most importantly, the absence of obvious diseases. A man's social status before capture meant nothing. Nobles, farmers, merchants, and soldiers all found themselves being prodded and examined. Like cattle at market, Marcus Flavius, a Roman historian, recorded the process of slave selection after the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD. He wrote about watching former Jewish soldiers being forced to demonstrate their rowing ability on dry land, their arms still bleeding from battle wounds. Those who couldn't maintain the required rhythm were immediately executed. Those who could were branded with hot iron and marched to the nearest port. Criminal punishment. Roman courts regularly sentenced criminals to the galleys as an alternative to immediate execution. This punishment, called damnatio ad remmum or condemnation to the oar, was reserved for the most serious crimes. Murder, treason, violent robbery, and desertion from the military all carried potential galley sentences. The legal documents from Pompeii reveal that judges often preferred galley sentences over execution because they served multiple purposes. The criminal suffered tremendously, the state gained a valuable worker, and families couldn't claim the body for proper burial rites, adding spiritual torment to physical punishment. What made this punishment particularly cruel was its indefinite nature. Unlike other criminal sentences that had set terms, galley slavery typically lasted until death. The legal phrase used was donec vita suppetite, until life gives out. Debt slavery, economic collapse, could also lead to the galleys. Roman law allowed creditors to sell debtors into slavery under specific circumstances. When a man couldn't pay his debts, creditors could petition the courts for permission to recover their losses through slave sales. However, debt slaves bound for the galleys were often the result of more complex schemes. Wealthy Romans would sometimes deliberately trap small farmers or tradesmen in impossible debt situations. Knowing that galley slaves commanded high prices from naval contractors, the process was methodical and legal. First, the creditor would demand immediate payment of debts that were originally structured for long-term repayment. When the debtor inevitably couldn't pay, the creditor would add massive interest penalties and court fees. Finally, they would petition for slave sale to satisfy the inflated debt. Archaeological evidence from Roman Egypt includes papyrus documents showing this process in detail. One particularly well-preserved case involves a grain merchant named Lucius who borrowed money to expand his business. When his ships were delayed by storms, he couldn't make his payments. Within 6 months, his original debt of 1,000 denarii had grown to 8,000 denarii through penalties and fees. He was sold to a galley contractor to satisfy the debt, leaving his wife and children destitute. Piracy and kidnapping. The Mediterranean was infested with pirates who specifically targeted coastal towns to capture galley slaves. These weren't desperate criminals operating alone, but organized fleets that understood the economics of the slave trade. Pirates knew exactly what type of men brought the highest prices. They would raid fishing villages, farming communities, and even small cities, specifically seeking young, strong men. Women, children, and older men were often left behind or sold into other forms of slavery, as they had little value for galley work. The island of Cilicia, off the coast of modern-day Turkey, became the center of this trade. Pirates would establish temporary holding facilities where captured men were evaluated, sorted, and prepared for sale. The process was surprisingly sophisticated, with different facilities specializing in different types of slaves. Captured men destined for the galleys underwent a brutal preparation process. They were kept on starvation diets to reduce their weight while maintaining muscle mass. They were forced to practice rowing motions for hours each day. Those who showed signs of rebellion were beaten severely or killed as examples to others. Roman naval records indicate that pirates supplied roughly 30% of all galley slaves during the peak years of the empire. This created a horrible cycle, where Roman ships powered by slaves would hunt pirates who captured more slaves to power more ships. Chapter 2. The physical reality of galley slavery. The moment a man was designated for galley service, his old life ended completely. The transformation from human being to human machine began immediately and was designed to break both body and spirit. The branding and shackling process. Every galley slave received a brand burned into their forehead or shoulder. The mark wasn't just identification. It was a permanent sign of their status that could never be hidden. The branding iron was heated until it glowed white-hot, and the brand was applied without any pain relief. Roman records describe several standard brands. Gal for galley slave was most common, but some contractors used more elaborate marks indicating the ship or fleet. The brand of Admiral Titus Vespasianus included not just letters, but also a small galley symbol, making escape and hiding nearly impossible. After branding came the shackles. These weren't simple chains, but sophisticated restraint systems designed by engineers who understood both human anatomy and the mechanics of rowing. Each slave received iron cuffs around both wrists and ankles. The wrist cuffs were connected by a chain to the oar, while ankle chains were bolted directly to the ship's hull. The shackles were fitted while the iron was still warm from forging, ensuring a perfect fit that couldn't be slipped off. The metal would cool and contract around the slave's limbs, creating permanent indentations in the skin. Archaeological remains of galley slaves show distinctive groove marks in the wrist and ankle bones where the shackles wore away the bone over years of use. The rowing benches. Roman galleys were marvels of engineering, but for the men who powered them, they were floating prisons designed around efficiency rather than humanity. The largest galleys, called queen quiremes, could hold up to 300 rowers, arranged in multiple tiers. Each rowing bench was exactly 18 inches wide, just enough space for a man to sit, but not enough to lie down comfortably. The benches were angled slightly forward, forcing rowers to lean into their work and making rest impossible. Behind each bench was a narrow channel where human waste would flow toward the bilge pumps. The oars themselves were massive instruments of torture, disguised as tools. A standard galley oar measured 12 to 15 feet in length and weighed between 40 and 60 pounds. The handle end was wrapped in leather that was never cleaned or replaced, becoming slick with blood, sweat, and infected tissue from thousands of hands. Each oar was shared by 3 to 5 men, but they weren't working together cooperatively. Instead, each man was responsible for a specific portion of each stroke, creating a complex rhythm that had to be maintained perfectly, or the oar would strike other oars or catch in the water improperly. Roman naval manuals discovered in Egyptian papyrus collections provide exact specifications for galley construction. The distance between benches was calculated to maximize the number of rowers, while preventing any possibility of rest or communication. Men couldn't turn to face each other, couldn't stand up fully, and couldn't lie down flat. Daily physical demands a galley slave's day began before dawn and ended after sunset. The rowing schedule was determined by wind conditions, tactical needs, and the whims of the ship's commander. On average, slaves rowed for 12 to 16 hours per day, with brief breaks only for water and minimal food. The physical demands were carefully calculated to extract maximum work without killing slaves too quickly. Romans understood that replacing dead slaves was expensive, so they developed systems to maintain their human machines just above the point of death. Each stroke of the oar required the full engagement of a man's back, shoulders, arms, and core muscles. The weight of the oar, combined with the resistance of the water, meant that every stroke was equivalent to lifting a heavy weight. Over the course of a day, a galley slave would effectively lift several tons of weight thousands of times. Medical. Papyri from Roman Egypt describe the physical deterioration of galley slaves in clinical detail. Within the first month, most developed open sores on their hands that never healed. The constant chafing of the oar handle would wear through calluses and into the underlying tissue, creating permanent wounds that became infected and reinfected. The sitting position required for rowing caused severe damage to the spine and hips. Slaves developed a characteristic hunched posture that persisted even when they weren't rowing. Their shoulder blades would actually change shape from the repetitive motion, creating bony protrusions that made lying down painful. The rhythm of survival. Everything aboard a Roman galley revolved around the drum. The rhythm wasn't just about coordination. It was about survival. The drummer, typically a free man, controlled the pace of life and death with his beat. During normal cruising, the drum maintained a steady rhythm of about 20 strokes per minute. This pace could be sustained for hours without killing too many slaves. But during battle or emergency situations, the pace could increase to 40 or even 50 strokes per minute, a rate that would kill weaker slaves within hours. The drumbeat wasn't just a metronome. It was a complex communication system. Different rhythms indicated different maneuvers. A rapid staccato beat meant prepare for ramming speed. A slow, irregular beat meant stealth rowing for surprise attacks. Long pauses in the rhythm meant rest, though rest for a galley slave meant simply stopping the rowing motion while remaining chained to the bench. Slaves who missed the rhythm were immediately punished. A Roman galley carried several overseers, whose only job was to watch for rowing mistakes and deliver punishment. These men carried leather whips embedded with metal studs that could tear flesh with a single strike. The punishment system was designed around terror rather than correction. Missing one stroke earned a lash across the back. Missing 2 strokes earned 5 lashes. Missing 3 strokes could mean death, depending on the overseer's mood and the tactical situation. Living conditions below deck, the lower deck of a Roman galley, was a vision of hell that would be difficult to imagine if it weren't so well documented. Roman engineers designed these spaces for maximum efficiency, which meant minimum humanity. Ventilation was almost non-existent. The only air circulation came from small hatches that were often closed during bad weather or battle. The air below deck was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, infected wounds, vomit, and human waste. Temperature control was impossible. In the Mediterranean summer, the lower deck could reach temperatures of over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Metal shackles would become too hot to touch, burning the skin of slaves who couldn't move away from them. In winter, the same metal would freeze, causing frostbite on already damaged skin. The noise was constant and deafening. The sound of 300 men breathing heavily, the creaking of wood under stress, the splash of oars in water, and the constant drumbeat created a cacophony that made sleep nearly impossible. Many slaves went deaf within their first year of service. Human waste was a constant problem. Slaves couldn't leave their benches, so they had to relieve themselves where they sat. Roman galleys included a primitive drainage system that was supposed to carry waste overboard, but it frequently clogged or backed up, leaving men sitting in their own filth for days at a time. Disease spread rapidly in these conditions. Skin infections, respiratory diseases, and digestive ailments were universal among galley slaves. Roman medical texts describe several diseases that were specific to galley slaves, including a particular type of lung infection caused by constantly breathing the foul air below deck. Chapter 3. Food, Water, and the Science of Minimal Survival. Roman galley masters faced a complex logistical challenge: how to keep hundreds of men alive and working while carrying the minimum amount of supplies. The solution they developed was a scientific approach to human degradation that kept slaves just above the point of death. The starvation diet. Galley slaves received exactly enough food to maintain their muscle mass and basic brain function, but not enough to maintain health or hope. Roman nutritionists working with galley contractors had calculated the minimum caloric intake required to sustain rowing activity. The standard daily ration consisted of 1 pound of bread made from the cheapest grain available, usually barley, mixed with sawdust or ground bones to add bulk. This bread was often moldy or infested with insects, but slaves who refused to eat were beaten until they complied. Along with the bread, each slave received a small portion of olive oil, not for nutrition, but because fat was necessary to prevent complete muscle deterioration. The oil was often rancid, having been stored in the ship's hold for months, but it provided essential calories that kept the slaves functional. Protein came in the form of small amounts of dried fish, or, more commonly, a paste made from fish, scraps, and salt. This paste was high in sodium, which served dual purposes. It provided some protein while increasing thirst, making the slaves more grateful for their limited water rations. Roman accountants kept detailed records of feeding costs, and these documents reveal the cold calculation behind slave nutrition. Feeding a galley slave cost approximately 1/10 as much as feeding a Roman soldier. Yet the slave was expected to perform more physical labor than any soldier ever would. The timing of meals was as important as their content. Slaves were fed only twice per day, once before dawn and once after sunset. This schedule ensured that they were never rowing on full stomachs, which might make them sluggish, but also never completely empty, which would lead to collapse. Water, the ultimate control mechanism. Water was more precious than gold aboard a Roman galley, and it was used as the primary method of controlling slave behavior. Each slave received exactly 1 cup of water every 4 hours during rowing periods. This amount was sufficient to prevent immediate death from dehydration, but insufficient to maintain proper kidney function or mental clarity. The water itself was often contaminated. Fresh water stored in wooden barrels for weeks or months developed algae, bacteria, and parasites. Slaves who became sick from the water were given no medical treatment and often died, which the galley master saw as a natural form of population control. During punishment, water rations were reduced or eliminated entirely. A slave who missed too many drumbeats might have his water withheld for 8 or 12 hours. In the heat of the Mediterranean sun, this was often a death sentence. The psychological effect of constant thirst was intentional. Dehydrated men became docile and focused only on survival. They lost the mental capacity for rebellion or escape planning. Roman psychological treatises found in the library at Alexandria specifically discuss the use of controlled dehydration as a method of maintaining discipline among slaves. The economics of human fuel. Roman galley contractors operated on tight profit margins, and every aspect of slave maintenance was calculated for maximum economic efficiency. Dead slaves represented lost investment, but healthy slaves represented unnecessary expense. The optimal lifespan for a galley slave was calculated to be 3 to 5 years. This time frame provided enough service to justify the initial purchase price while avoiding the increased medical costs and decreased productivity that came with longer-term slaves. Replacement costs were factored into every decision. During the peak years of Roman naval power, a healthy galley slave cost between 500 and 800 denarii, roughly equivalent to a skilled craftsman's annual wages. However, the same slave would generate value equivalent to 2,000 to 3,000 denarii over his working lifespan. These economic calculations led to some horrific practices. Slaves who became injured or sick were often thrown overboard immediately rather than being given medical treatment. The cost of medicine and the lost productivity during recovery were considered greater than the cost of purchasing a replacement slave. Roman accountants also calculated the optimal ratio of new slaves to experienced slaves. New slaves had higher energy but required training and were more likely to attempt escape or rebellion. Experienced slaves were more compliant but had reduced physical capacity. The ideal ratio was determined to be 60% experienced slaves and 40% new slaves. Feast and famine cycles, galley operations, followed predictable patterns that created cycles of relative abundance and severe deprivation for the slaves. During winter months, when most ships were pulled ashore for maintenance, slaves might receive slightly better rations as they were used for dock work and ship repair. However, these better conditions came with a price. Slaves who gained weight and strength during winter were expected to work longer hours and at higher intensity when the sailing season resumed. The brief period of better treatment was designed to extract maximum value during the crucial summer campaign season. During active military campaigns, slave rations were often reduced to save cargo space for weapons and supplies. A Roman galley preparing for battle might carry only enough food to keep slaves alive for the duration of the campaign, with no safety margin for delays or extended operations. The most horrific periods were during sieges or blockades, when ships might be required to remain at sea for weeks or months without resupply. During these operations, slave rations were reduced to starvation levels. Historical records from the Siege of Syracuse describe galley slaves eating leather from their oars and drinking seawater mixed with their own urine. Medical care. The science of minimal intervention. Roman galley masters employed ship doctors. But these medical professionals were not there to care for the slave's health. Instead, they were tasked with maintaining the slave's working capacity, using the minimum possible resources. The medical approach was purely utilitarian. Infections that didn't interfere with rowing were ignored. Broken bones were set only if they affected or handling. Diseases were treated only if they threatened to spread to the free crew members. Ship doctors carried a limited range of medical supplies, all chosen for their cost-effectiveness rather than their healing properties. Vinegar was used to clean wounds, not because it was particularly effective, but because it was cheap and could also be used to preserve food. Hot iron was used to cauterize serious wounds, again chosen for its low cost and dual utility as a tool for maintaining equipment. Pain relief was virtually non-existent. Roman medical texts describe the use of certain herbs for pain management, but these were reserved for free crew members. Slaves in agony were expected to continue rowing, and those who couldn't maintain the rhythm due to pain were beaten until they complied or died. The ship's doctor also served as the arbiter of life and death for seriously injured slaves. When a slave was too damaged to continue working, the doctor would make an economic calculation. Could the slave be restored to working condition for less than the cost of a replacement? If not, the slave would be thrown overboard, often while still alive. Chapter 4. Punishment, Death, and the Psychology of Despair. The Roman system of galley slavery wasn't maintained through shackles and guards alone. It relied on a sophisticated understanding of human psychology that broke men's spirits as thoroughly as the physical labor broke their bodies. The hierarchy of punishment. Roman galley masters developed an elaborate system of punishments that were designed to maintain discipline while preserving the slaves' ability to work. Every infraction had a corresponding punishment, and these were applied with mechanical consistency that left no room for hope or mercy. The lowest level of punishment was the withdrawal of water rations. A slave who was caught talking during rowing periods would have his next water ration withheld. This might seem minor, but in the dehydrating environment of a galley, even a few hours without water could cause significant physical distress. Physical beatings were the next level of punishment. Roman overseers used whips specifically designed for galley work. These weren't simple leather straps, but complex instruments with multiple leather cords embedded with small metal studs. A single stroke could create dozens of small puncture wounds that would become infected in the filthy conditions below deck. The whipping technique was standardized throughout the Roman Navy. Overseers were trained to deliver maximum pain while avoiding damage to the slave's arms and shoulders, the body parts essential for rowing. Strikes were concentrated on the back and legs, areas where even severe damage wouldn't immediately interfere with work capacity. For more serious infractions, Romans employed punishment, crucifixion. This wasn't the execution method used for criminals, but a temporary crucifixion designed to create maximum psychological impact. The offending slave would be nailed to a cross erected on the ship's deck, visible to all the other slaves. After several hours of agony, the slave would be taken down and returned to his rowing bench. The message was clear. Death was not an escape from service. The use of example killings. Roman galley commanders understood that the occasional execution could be more effective than constant minor punishments. These executions were carefully planned theatrical events designed to terrorize the entire slave population. The most common method was feeding the sharks. A slave selected for example killing would be dragged to the ship's rail in full view of his fellow slaves. Weights would be tied to his ankles, and he would be thrown overboard alive. The sharks that followed Roman galleys, attracted by the constant disposal of dead slaves, would often attack the victim before he drowned. These executions were timed for maximum psychological impact. They typically occurred during the evening meal, when all slaves were briefly at rest and could fully focus on the horror being displayed. The victim was usually chosen not for the severity of his crime, but for his popularity among the other slaves. Roman psychological warfare texts preserved in the military archives at Constantinople specifically discussed the use of example killings to maintain discipline. The recommended frequency was 1 execution per month per 100 slaves, with the timing varied to prevent slaves from becoming psychologically adjusted to the routine. Breaking bonds between slaves, Romans recognized that solidarity among slaves posed the greatest threat to the galley system. Elaborate measures were taken to prevent slaves from forming meaningful relationships or organizing resistance. Slaves were deliberately mixed from different regions and cultures. A single rowing bench might include a Germanic warrior, a Jewish merchant, an Egyptian farmer, and a Greek sailor. Language barriers prevented communication, and cultural differences prevented sympathy. When slaves were caught communicating, both participants were punished, regardless of the content of their conversation. This created an atmosphere of suspicion where slaves could never be sure if their bench partners were friends or potential informants. The Romans also employed slave informants who were given small privileges in exchange for reporting on their fellow slaves. These informants were rotated regularly and never identified, so slaves could never know who might be reporting their words or actions. Family members who were enslaved together were deliberately separated and assigned to different ships. Roman slave dealers kept detailed records to ensure that fathers and sons, or brothers, never served on the same galley. This prevented the emotional bonds that might motivate desperate escape attempts or rebellion. The psychology of learned helplessness, Roman galley. Masters had observed a psychological phenomenon that modern scientists would later call learned helplessness. They noticed that slaves who had been in service for more than a year rarely attempted escape, even when opportunities presented themselves. This psychological condition was actively cultivated through a system of unpredictable rewards and punishments. Occasionally, a slave who had performed well might receive an extra ration of water or a brief respite from rowing. These rewards were given randomly with no clear connection to the slave's behavior, creating a sense that survival was entirely dependent on luck rather than action. The unpredictability extended to punishments as well. Sometimes serious infractions were ignored, while minor mistakes resulted in severe beatings. This inconsistency prevented slaves from developing strategies for avoiding punishment, leading them to become passive and resigned to their fate. Roman military psychologists attached to the naval academies studied this phenomenon extensively. Their reports, found in the archives at Ravenna, describe techniques for inducing psychological submission that were remarkably sophisticated for their time. Religious and spiritual destruction, Romans understood that spiritual beliefs could provide slaves with hope and motivation for resistance. Systematic efforts were made to destroy the religious practices and beliefs of galley slaves. Slaves were forbidden from praying in their native languages or performing any religious rituals. Those caught practicing their traditional religions were subject to particularly severe punishments, including mutilation of body parts associated with their faith. Roman galley slaves were forced to participate in Roman religious ceremonies, particularly those honoring Neptune and other sea gods. These forced conversions were designed to replace the slaves' traditional sources of spiritual strength with worship of the very gods who were supposed to protect their oppressors. The timing of religious ceremonies was used as another form of psychological warfare. Roman religious observances were scheduled during the slaves' brief rest periods, denying them even the small comfort of a few minutes of peace. The final despair, witnessing others' freedom, perhaps. The cruelest aspect of galley slavery was the constant reminder of the freedom that had been lost. Galley slaves could see free sailors working on the same ships, free passengers traveling to distant ports, and free merchants conducting business in every harbor. During port calls, slaves were sometimes allowed on deck to help with loading and unloading cargo. This glimpse of the normal world was psychologically devastating for many slaves who realized how completely their old lives had been erased. The contrast was deliberate. Roman galley commanders believed that showing slaves what they had lost was more effective than simply hiding freedom from them. The sight of free men living normal lives served as a constant reminder of what the slaves would never have again. Some slaves developed a condition that Roman medical texts called vita mortua, living death. These men continued to row and follow orders, but showed no emotion, spoke to no one, and seemed to have lost all awareness of their surroundings except for the rhythm of the drum and the weight of the oar. Death as the only liberation in the Roman galley system. Death was not just common, it was inevitable and often welcomed. The average galley slave survived between 2 and 4 years of service, depending on his initial health and the intensity of the ship's operational schedule. Most deaths were slow and agonizing. Exhaustion, disease, and infected wounds killed far more slaves than accidents or punishment. Men would gradually waste away, their bodies consuming their own muscle tissue to survive, until they could no longer maintain the rowing rhythm. When a slave died at his oar, his body was immediately thrown overboard to prevent disease and to make room for a replacement. There were no burial rites, no moments of silence, no acknowledgement that a human life had ended. The rhythm of the drum continued without pause. Some slaves chose suicide over continued service, despite the almost impossible conditions that made self-harm difficult. Men would deliberately injure themselves so severely that they couldn't row, knowing that this would result in execution. Others would throw themselves overboard during the brief moments when they were brought on deck. The Romans took measures to prevent suicide, not out of compassion, but to protect their investment. Slaves were watched constantly, and any sign of suicidal behavior resulted in immediate punishment. Even successful suicides were punished posthumously. The bodies were mutilated and thrown to sharks as a warning to other slaves. Chapter 5. The economics of human misery. Behind every aspect of Roman galley slavery lay cold economic calculation. The system wasn't maintained because Romans were inherently cruel, but because it was extraordinarily profitable and efficient. Understanding these economics reveals how an entire civilization could participate in systematic human destruction. The slave trade infrastructure, Roman galley slavery required a massive commercial infrastructure that stretched across the Mediterranean world. Slave dealers, ship contractors, training facilities, and supply networks all worked together to maintain a steady flow of human machinery to the Roman navy. The slave markets of major Roman ports were sophisticated commercial operations. Dealers specialized in different types of slaves, with galley slaves commanding premium prices due to their specific sleeve. I commanding /Movilius, and leaves a rich /market, more lostly /markets. The slave markets of major marching more /marching marchix, may /splashel /magic, divided /slav. May /slives, bealize, may /slav, /it, my /slas, dot slide, may /abyssid, dot slies, we slies it to me, they sly it slide, they sly it slap you slide, have co make it's to sike with it sike it's I sits it, skikake kitatil I sikodik the kikapit sik to be cookie to the bed we physical requirements. The market at Delos, one of the largest slave trading centers, could process over 10,000 slaves per day during peak seasons. Quality grading systems were developed to standardize slave pricing. Galley slaves were classified into categories based on age, physical condition, and estimated working lifespan. A grade A slave, typically a man between 18 and 25 years old, with perfect health and no visible scars, could sell for 1,000 denarii or more. The grading process was conducted by professional slave evaluators who examined potential galley slaves like livestock. They checked teeth for signs of disease, tested muscle strength and flexibility, and examined scars to determine the slave's history of resistance or punishment. Training facilities operated throughout the Roman Empire to prepare slaves for galley service. These institutions, called ergastula nauticus, were designed to break in new slaves while maximizing their sale value. Slaves would spend weeks learning to row in perfect rhythm, building the specific muscle groups needed for galley work, and being psychologically conditioned for absolute obedience. The mathematics of human depreciation, Roman accountants developed sophisticated methods for calculating the value and depreciation of galley slaves. These financial instruments treated human beings exactly like any other piece of equipment, with predictable lifespans and declining productivity curves. The initial purchase price of a galley slave was just the beginning of the financial calculation. Transportation costs, feeding expenses, medical costs, and replacement planning all factored into the total cost of ownership. Roman financial papyri showed that the true cost of maintaining a galley slave was approximately 150% of the initial purchase price over the slave's working lifespan. Depreciation schedules were calculated based on actuarial data collected from hundreds of galleys over decades of operation. Roman naval contractors knew that a slave's productivity would decline by approximately 10% per year due to physical deterioration. psychological breakdown, and accumulated injuries. Insurance markets developed around galley slave investments. Wealthy Romans could purchase policies that would compensate them for slaves lost to disease, accident, or rebellion. These insurance contracts, preserved in the Hecanacti archive, reveal the cold financial calculations that surrounded human suffering. The insurance policies contained detailed clauses about what constituted compensable losses. Natural death from exhaustion was not covered, as it was considered a normal business expense. Death from disease was covered only if it affected more than 20% of a ship's slave population. Death from rebellion was covered, but at reduced rates if the rebellion lasted more than 3 days, as this was considered evidence of poor management. Profit margins and return on investment. The profitability of galley slavery was enormous, which explains why the system persisted for centuries despite its obvious moral problems. Roman financial records show that galley slave operations typically generated profits of 300% to 500% over the slaves' working lifespans. A typical quinquireme required 300 galley slaves, representing an initial investment of approximately 180,000 denarii over a 3-year operational period. These slaves would generate value equivalent to 720,000 denarii through their labor. After deducting feeding, maintenance, and replacement costs, the net profit was usually between 400,000 and 500,000 denarii. These enormous profits attracted investment from across Roman society. Wealthy senators, successful merchants, and even some emperors invested in galley operations through limited partnerships that allowed them to profit from slavery, without direct involvement in its daily horrors. The Roman Stock Exchange, located in the Forum Romanum, traded shares in galley operations alongside other commercial ventures. Daily price listings, preserved on stone tablets, show that galley slave investments were considered among the most reliable and profitable in the empire. The ripple effects throughout Roman society. The economic success of galley slavery created dependencies throughout Roman society that made the system difficult to eliminate, even when some Romans began to question its morality. Entire industries developed around supporting galley operations, employing thousands of free Romans whose livelihoods depended on continued slavery. Shipbuilding industries designed vessels specifically optimized for slave labor rather than efficiency or safety. Roman naval architecture evolved to prioritize the number of slaves that could be crammed into a ship rather than speed or maneuverability. These design priorities influenced Roman naval tactics and strategy for centuries. Food production systems developed around feeding large numbers of slaves at minimum cost. Entire agricultural regions specialized in producing the low-quality grains and preserved foods that constituted slave rations. Farmers, millers, and food processors all profited from the systematic malnourishment of galley slaves. Manufacturing industries produced the specialized equipment needed for galley slavery: shackles, chains, whips, and the other instruments of oppression. These weren't cottage industries, but major commercial operations that employed skilled craftsmen and generated substantial tax revenue for Roman cities. The financial success of galley slavery also created political constituencies that defended the system. Senators whose wealth came from slave investments used their political power to block any reforms that might threaten their profits. Laws that might have improved conditions for slaves were routinely defeated by legislators whose personal finances depended on slave labor. International trade and diplomatic implications. Roman galley slavery had international economic implications that extended far beyond the boundaries of the empire. The demand for slaves created markets and trade relationships that shaped the politics of the entire Mediterranean region. Barbarian tribes along the Roman frontier discovered that capturing and selling prisoners to Roman slave dealers was far more profitable than traditional raiding and warfare. This economic incentive fundamentally changed the nature of tribal conflicts. as warriors began fighting specifically to capture slaves rather than to win territory or glory. Diplomatic relationships between Rome and other nations were often structured around slave trading agreements. Treaties with Egyptian pharaohs, for example, included provisions for the regular delivery of convicted criminals to Roman slave markets. These diplomatic arrangements created international legal frameworks that legitimized and institutionalized human trafficking. The economic power generated by galley slavery also gave Rome significant advantages in international negotiations. Roman diplomats could offer massive bribes funded by slave profits, secure in the knowledge that their human machinery would continue generating wealth to support Roman foreign policy. The hidden costs of human machinery while galley slavery generated enormous profits for investors. It also created hidden costs that were borne by Roman society as a whole. These external costs were never included in the financial calculations of individual slave owners, but they represented significant drains on the Roman economy. Security costs were enormous. The constant threat of slave rebellions required substantial military resources to suppress. Roman legions were regularly diverted from frontier defense to deal with slave uprisings, weakening the empire's external security to maintain internal oppression. Medical costs mounted as diseases that originated in galley slave populations spread to free Romans. The crowded, unsanitary conditions aboard galleys created ideal breeding grounds for infectious diseases that would spread to port cities and eventually throughout the empire. Environmental costs accumulated as the galley slave system encouraged wasteful and destructive practices. Ships powered by disposable human labor had no incentive to develop more efficient propulsion systems or more sustainable operating practices. The moral costs, while harder to quantify economically, were perhaps the most significant. The Roman practice of galley slavery required the systematic dehumanization of entire populations, creating psychological and cultural damage that weakened Roman civilization from within. Chapter Y. Rebellion, Resistance, and the Illusion of Hope. Why? Despite the overwhelming oppression of the galley system, human resistance never completely died. The forms this resistance took reveal both the incredible resilience of the human spirit and the terrifying efficiency of Roman methods for crushing hope. The practical impossibility of organized rebellion. Roman galley masters had learned from early slave revolts and designed their systems to make organized resistance virtually impossible. Every aspect of galley operation was structured to prevent slaves from communicating, planning, or acting together. The physical layout of Roman galleys made conspiracy almost impossible. Slaves were chained facing forward, unable to turn around to make eye contact with others. The constant noise of rowing, creaking wood, and shouted orders made quiet conversation impossible. Even during the brief rest periods, overseers moved constantly among the slaves, listening for any signs of communication. Language barriers were deliberately maintained and exploited. Roman slave dealers made sure that each rowing section included men from different regions who spoke different languages. A typical galley might include Germanic tribesmen, Gallic warriors, Jewish merchants, Egyptian farmers, and Greek sailors, all unable to communicate effectively with each other. The rotation system prevented slaves from forming lasting relationships, even if two slaves managed to communicate despite the barriers. They would likely be separated within weeks as slaves were moved between ships for operational reasons or simply to prevent the formation of bonds. Information control was absolute. Galley slaves had no knowledge of their location, destination, or the length of their voyages. They couldn't see the sun or stars to navigate, couldn't overhear conversations about ports or timing, and had no access to any information that might help them plan escape attempts. Individual acts of defiance while organized rebellion was nearly impossible. Individual acts of resistance occurred regularly aboard Roman galleys. These small rebellions rarely achieved anything beyond the immediate satisfaction of defying oppression. But they represented the persistent refusal of the human spirit to accept complete subjugation. Work slowdowns were the most common form of resistance. A slave might deliberately miss drum beats, handle his or clumsily, or row with less than full strength. These acts of sabotage were usually subtle enough to avoid immediate detection, but could accumulate to reduce the ship's speed and efficiency. The Romans developed sophisticated methods for detecting work slowdowns. Overseers were trained to watch for specific signs: irregularities in rowing rhythm, inconsistent oar angles, or slaves who seemed to be working hard but weren't producing proportional results. Suspected malingerers faced immediate punishment. But the fact that Romans needed such elaborate detection systems shows how widespread subtle resistance actually was. Self-injury was another form of resistance, despite the terrible consequences. Slaves would deliberately injure their hands, arms, or shoulders to reduce their rowing capacity. Some would bite through their own tongues to avoid having to respond to orders. Others would injure themselves so severely that they couldn't work, knowing that this would result in death, but preferring execution to continued slavery. The Romans tried to prevent self-injury through constant surveillance and immediate punishment for any suspicious wounds. Ship doctors were trained to distinguish between accidental injuries and deliberate self-harm, and slaves caught injuring themselves faced torture before execution. Psychological resistance took many forms. Some slaves would refuse to learn Latin commands, forcing overseers to use physical signals instead of verbal orders. Others would pretend to be mentally incompetent, acting confused or unresponsive to reduce expectations for their performance. Religious resistance was particularly important to many slaves. Despite severe punishments, slaves continued to practice their traditional religions in secret. They would pray silently during rowing, trace religious symbols in the dirt during rest periods, or recite traditional prayers in their native languages when they thought they couldn't be heard. The Spartacus model, why it couldn't work on galleys. The famous rebellion led by Spartacus had occurred on land, where slaves could move freely, gather weapons, and recruit supporters. Roman galley masters studied this rebellion carefully and designed their systems to make such uprisings impossible aboard ships. Galley slaves had no access to weapons. Every tool aboard ship was carefully controlled and accounted for. Even eating utensils were chained to prevent their use as weapons. The only potential weapons available to slaves were their own shackles and chains, but these were designed to be impossible to remove without specialized tools. Escape routes were non-existent, like land-based slaves who might flee to forests, mountains, or foreign territories. Galley slaves were surrounded by water and couldn't swim while chained. Even if they somehow freed themselves from their shackles, they would still be trapped aboard a ship controlled by armed guards. Leadership. Recruitment was prevented by the isolation system. Spartacus had been able to identify and recruit other potential leaders among the gladiators. But galley slaves had no opportunity to identify or communicate with others who might have leadership capabilities. The timeline for action was completely controlled by the Romans. Land-based slaves could plan rebellions over months or years, waiting for optimal conditions. Galley slaves had no control over timing and no advanced knowledge of when opportunities might arise. Famous rebellion attempts and their failures, despite the overwhelming obstacles. Several major rebellion attempts occurred aboard Roman galleys. These uprisings were invariably crushed, but their stories reveal both the desperation of the slaves and the ruthless efficiency of Roman suppression methods. The rebellion of Marcus the Gaul occurred in 73 BC aboard a quinquareme carrying 300 slaves. Marcus had been a chieftain before his capture and somehow managed to communicate his identity. 2 other Celtic slaves aboard the ship. During a severe storm that had brought most of the free crew on deck, Marcus and 12 other slaves managed to break their chains using a technique that was never clearly documented. The rebellion lasted exactly 47 minutes, while the slaves managed to kill 3 overseers and reach the ship's weapons locker before being overwhelmed by the remaining crew. Marcus and his co-conspirators were crucified on the ship's deck and left hanging for 3 days as an example to the other slaves. The remaining Celtic slaves were thrown overboard alive. Roman naval records preserved detailed accounts of this rebellion, including interviews with surviving crew members and analysis of how the slaves had managed to break their chains. New shackling techniques were developed specifically to prevent the method Marcus had used and additional security measures were implemented fleet-wide. The Great Uprising of 67 BC involved multiple ships and represented the largest galley slave rebellion in Roman history. It began when a Roman fleet was trapped in harbor during a prolonged siege, and food supplies began running low. The decision was made to reduce slave rations to starvation levels to preserve food for the free crew. Desperate slaves on 7 different ships somehow coordinated a simultaneous uprising. The rebellion began at dawn when slaves throughout the fleet began chanting in unison, apparently a signal that had been planned in advance. Over 2,000 slaves were involved in the initial uprising. The rebellion initially succeeded in capturing 4 ships, but the slaves had no knowledge of seamanship and couldn't navigate the vessels. Within 6 hours, Roman Marines had retaken all the ships and crushed the uprising. The punishment was systematic and horrific. Every 3rd slave was executed, regardless of their level of participation in the rebellion. The investigation that followed revealed that the uprising had been coordinated through a complex system of hand signals and coded messages that had developed over months of careful planning. The Roman response was to increase the rotation of slaves between ships and to implement new surveillance methods that made such coordination virtually impossible in the future. The psychology of false hope. Roman galley masters discovered that completely crushing all hope was counterproductive, as slaves with no hope at all would simply give up and die, reducing their work capacity. Instead, they developed systems that maintained just enough hope to keep slaves functional while ensuring that any hopes they maintained were ultimately false. Rumors were deliberately planted among slave populations about possible freedom, redemption, or improved conditions. These rumors were designed to be believable enough to maintain motivation, but vague enough that they couldn't be verified or disproven. Slaves might hear whispers about a general amnesty being planned, or about ships where slaves were treated better, or about opportunities to earn freedom through exceptional service. These false hopes served multiple purposes. They gave slaves something to live for, which maintained their work capacity. They created competition among slaves, as each hoped to be selected for whatever improvement they had heard about. They also provided information to Roman overseers about which slaves were most susceptible to hope, and therefore most likely to attempt escape or rebellion. The manipulation of hope was incredibly sophisticated. Romans understood that hope needed to be occasionally reinforced to remain believable. Very rarely, a slave might actually be freed or granted improved conditions, not out of mercy, but to validate the hopes of the remaining slaves and ensure their continued cooperation. The ultimate irony? Freedom as punishment. Perhaps the cruelest aspect of the Roman galley system was that even when slaves were eventually freed, their freedom was often worse than their slavery had been. After years of galley service, former slaves were physically and psychologically destroyed, unable to function in normal society. Most galley slaves who survived their service were freed only when they became too damaged to be useful. These men had no skills beyond rowing, no social connections, and no resources. Many became beggars or died of starvation within months of their release. The physical damage was usually irreversible. Years of malnutrition had stunted their growth and weakened their bones. Constant rowing had deformed their spines and shoulders. Untreated injuries had left many partially disabled. Dental problems from poor nutrition made eating difficult even. When food was available, the psychological damage was often worse than the physical harm. Former galley slaves had been so thoroughly conditioned to follow orders that they couldn't make independent decisions. They had been isolated from human contact for so long that they couldn't form normal relationships. Many suffered from what modern psychologists would recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. Roman society had no support systems for former slaves, and the visible signs of galley service made former slaves unemployable in most occupations. The hunched posture, the scars from shackles, and the psychological damage were immediately recognizable to any Roman who saw them. This created a final, terrible irony. Freedom became another form of punishment. Slaves who had dreamed of liberty discovered that their slavery had so thoroughly destroyed them that freedom was meaningless. Many former galley slaves, actually, attempted to return to slavery, begging to be sold back into service because they couldn't survive as free men. Chapter Y. The Decline and Legacy of Galley Slavery. Why pa? Why? The Roman system of galley slavery didn't end because of moral awakening or slave rebellion. Like most institutions of oppression, it declined due to economic and technological changes that made alternative systems more profitable and efficient. Technological changes that reduced demand. The development of improved sail technology gradually reduced the Roman Navy's dependence on human-powered ships. Advances in rigging, sail design, and navigation made wind-powered vessels faster and more reliable than galleys in many situations. These technological improvements weren't motivated by humanitarian concerns, but by practical military considerations. Wind-powered ships required smaller crews, carried more cargo, and could operate for longer periods without resupply. The reduced operational costs made them attractive to Roman military planners, who were always looking for ways to reduce expenses. The development of new naval tactics also reduced the importance of galleys. The traditional galley tactic of ramming. Enemy ships required precise speed and maneuverability that only human-powered vessels could provide. However, as Roman naval warfare evolved to emphasize missile weapons and boarding actions, the tactical advantages of galleys became less important. Artillery technology particularly affected galley warfare. The development of effective ship-mounted catapults and ballistae meant that naval battles could be fought at longer ranges, where the speed and maneuverability advantages of galleys were less significant. These weapons were also too heavy to be effectively mounted on human-powered ships, giving wind-powered vessels a decisive advantage in firepower. Economic factors in the decline, the cost of maintaining galley slave operations gradually became prohibitive as the Roman economy faced increasing strain. The constant need to replace dead slaves, combined with rising slave prices due to reduced availability, made galley operations less profitable than they had been during the peak years of Roman expansion. Slave prices increased dramatically as the Roman Empire's expansion slowed and fewer prisoners of war became available. The traditional sources of galley slaves, conquered enemies, and criminal populations couldn't keep pace with the high mortality rates that characterized galley service. The development of alternative labor systems also affected the economics of galley slavery. Free sailors, while more expensive initially, proved to be more efficient and reliable than slaves in many situations. Free crews could be trained too. Higher skill levels were more motivated to perform well, and didn't require the extensive security apparatus needed to control slave populations. Insurance costs for galley operations increased steadily as the risks became better understood. The high mortality rates, frequent rebellions, and constant threat of disease outbreaks made galley slave operations increasingly expensive to insure. Some insurance companies stopped offering coverage for galley operations entirely. Roman tax policies also began to favor alternative shipping methods. As the empire's fiscal situation deteriorated, tax collectors found it easier to assess and collect levies from free merchant operations than from the complex slave-based galley systems. This created financial incentives for ship owners to abandon slave labor in favor of free crews. The role of early Christianity. The spread of Christianity throughout the Roman Empire created moral and practical challenges to the galley slave system. Though the religion's impact was gradual and complicated, early Christian theology emphasized the spiritual equality of all people, which contradicted the fundamental assumptions underlying slavery. However, Christian leaders were often reluctant to directly challenge slavery as an institution. Instead, focusing on encouraging better treatment of slaves and urging masters to consider the spiritual implications of their actions. Christian merchants and ship owners sometimes refused to invest in galley slave operations for religious reasons. While these individual decisions didn't significantly impact the overall system, they did create alternative models of ship operation that demonstrated the viability of free labor in maritime commerce. The Christian emphasis on redemption and forgiveness also created pressure for better treatment of criminal slaves. Some Christian judges began to impose alternative punishments for crimes that had traditionally resulted in galley sentences, reducing the supply of slaves from criminal sources. Christian charitable organizations sometimes attempted to purchase and free galley slaves, though the high cost of slaves and the legal restrictions on manumission limited the effectiveness of these efforts. These early abolition movements were too small to affect the overall system, but established precedents for later anti-slavery activism. Military decline and administrative decay. The general decline of Roman military power reduced the strategic importance of maintaining large galley fleets. As the empire became increasingly defensive rather than expansionist, the need for the type of aggressive naval operations that required galley slaves diminished significantly. Administrative corruption within the Roman military also undermined the galley system. Officers responsible for galley operations increasingly diverted funds intended for slave maintenance to their own use, leading to even worse conditions for slaves and higher mortality rates that made operations economically unsustainable. The breakdown of Roman military discipline meant that the strict security required for galley operations became harder to maintain. As military units became less reliable and disciplined, the risk of slave rebellions increased, making galley operations more dangerous and expensive. Political instability within the Roman Empire disrupted the complex administrative systems required to maintain galley slave operations. The legal frameworks for slave trading, the financial systems for funding operations, and the military structures for security all became less reliable as central authority weakened. Regional variations and decline. The end of galley slavery didn't happen uniformly throughout the Roman world. Different regions abandoned the practice at different times and for different reasons, creating a complex pattern of decline that extended over several centuries. In the Western Mediterranean, galley slavery declined relatively quickly as barbarian invasions disrupted traditional slave supply routes and made naval operations generally more difficult. The collapse of Roman authority in Gaul, Spain, and North Africa eliminated many of the sources of slaves and the administrative structures needed to manage galley operations. The Eastern Mediterranean maintained galley slave operations longer, partly because the Byzantine Empire preserved more of the Roman administrative and military structures needed to support such complex operations. However, even in the East, the practice gradually declined as economic and technological pressures made alternatives more attractive. Some Roman successor states attempted to maintain galley slave systems even after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, but these efforts were generally unsuccessful. The complex infrastructure required for effective galley operations was too dependent on the broader core Roman system to survive independently. Island communities and coastal cities sometimes continued using galley slaves on a smaller scale, long after the practice had been abandoned by major naval powers. However, these operations were generally small and locally focused. lacking the systematic efficiency that had characterized Roman galley slavery at its peak. The lasting impact on maritime technology the centuries of galley slavery had profound effects on the development of maritime technology that persisted long after the practice itself was abandoned. Roman shipbuilding techniques, navigation methods, and naval tactics all reflected the assumption that human labor would provide primary propulsion. This technological legacy actually slowed the development of more advanced sailing techniques. Because galley slavery had made human-powered ships effective for so long, there had been less incentive to develop the sailing technologies that were advancing more rapidly in regions where human-powered ships were less common. The physical infrastructure of Roman ports and naval bases was designed around galley operations and had to be extensively modified to accommodate sail-powered ships effectively. Harbor designs, dock configurations, and supply systems all reflected the specific needs of galley operations. The social and administrative structures developed to manage galley slaves also influenced later maritime labor systems. Many of the hierarchical management techniques, disciplinary methods, and operational procedures developed for controlling slaves were adapted for use with free crews, creating maritime labor traditions that persisted for centuries. Cultural memory and historical amnesia. One of the most striking aspects of the galley slavery system is how completely it disappeared from popular Roman memory after its decline. Unlike other forms of slavery that continued to be discussed and debated, galley slavery became virtually invisible in Roman historical and literary sources. This historical amnesia wasn't accidental, but reflected deliberate efforts by later Roman and Christian writers to minimize the discussion of practices that had become morally embarrassing. The systematic nature of galley slavery, with its deliberate dehumanization and calculated cruelty, was difficult to reconcile with later Roman claims about civilization and justice. Archaeological evidence suggests that the physical reminders of galley slavery were also deliberately removed or destroyed. Former galley facilities were often demolished rather than converted to other uses, and the specialized equipment used for galley operations was typically destroyed rather than preserved or repurposed. This cultural forgetting had significant historical consequences. Later civilizations that might have learned from the Roman experience with systematic maritime slavery instead had to rediscover both the techniques and the moral problems associated with such systems. Closing reflections. PA. Why pack? Why as we reach the end of our journey through the horrific reality of Roman galley slavery, it's worth reflecting on what this system reveals about human nature, civilization, and the costs of progress built on suffering. The banality of evil. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Roman galley slavery wasn't the cruelty itself, but how ordinary and bureaucratic it became. The system wasn't maintained by sadistic individuals, but by normal people doing normal jobs, within a system that had normalized human destruction. The slave dealers who evaluated human beings like livestock weren't monsters. They were businessmen applying professional standards to maximize profit. The ship captains who worked slaves to death weren't psychopaths, they were naval officers, following standard operational procedures. The investors who funded galley operations weren't evil masterminds. They were ordinary Romans seeking profitable investments. This systematization of cruelty allowed an entire civilization to participate in and profit from human misery while maintaining their self-image as civilized and moral people. The bureaucratic nature of the system diffused responsibility so effectively that no individual felt personally accountable for the suffering it caused. Modern historians studying Roman galley slavery often focus on the individual stories of cruelty and resistance, because these human elements are easier to comprehend than the systematic nature of the oppression. But it was precisely the system's impersonal efficiency that made it so devastating and so persistent. The technology of oppression, Roman galley slavery, represented one of history's most sophisticated applications of technology and organization to the problem of controlling human beings. Every aspect of the system, from ship design to financial instruments to psychological manipulation, was carefully engineered to extract maximum value from human life while minimizing the cost of maintenance. This technological approach to oppression has disturbing parallels in later historical periods. The Roman innovations in systematic dehumanization, population control, and the industrial exploitation of human labor provided blueprints that would be refined and reapplied by later civilizations. The Romans' ability to measure, quantify, and optimize human suffering represented a particular type of progress that modern societies must grapple with. The same analytical and organizational capabilities that enabled Roman engineering marvels and military victories also made possible the efficient destruction of human dignity on an industrial scale. The economics of moral blindness, the profitability of galley slavery created economic incentives that overwhelmed moral considerations throughout Roman society. The system's financial success made it resistant to reform and created constituencies that had powerful reasons to defend and expand it. This economic logic helps explain how intelligent, educated, and otherwise moral Romans could participate in and defend such an obviously brutal system. When entire economic systems depend on systematic oppression, the moral arguments against that oppression compete with powerful financial interests and deeply embedded social structures. The Roman experience demonstrates how economic prosperity can be built on hidden costs that are borne by those who have no political power to resist. The wealth and leisure that enabled Roman civilization's greatest achievements were partly funded by the systematic destruction of human life in places where comfortable Romans never had to look. The persistence of memory, although Roman galley slavery ended over 1,000 years ago, its legacy continues to shape our world in ways that are often invisible. The techniques of systematic oppression developed by the Romans influenced later systems of slavery and exploitation. The economic and administrative models pioneered in galley operations provided templates for other forms of industrial human exploitation. Perhaps more importantly, the Roman experience with galley slavery provides crucial lessons about how civilized societies can create and maintain systems of systematic oppression, while maintaining their self-image as moral and progressive. These lessons remain relevant as modern societies grapple with their own systems of exploitation and exclusion. The complete disappearance of galley slavery from popular Roman memory also demonstrates how societies can collectively forget uncomfortable truths about their past. This historical amnesia isn't just an ancient phenomenon, but a persistent human tendency that affects how all societies remember and learn from their experiences with systematic oppression. The individual in the system. Throughout our exploration of Roman galley slavery, we've seen how vast systems of oppression ultimately depend on individual human choices. Every aspect of the galley system, from the initial enslavement to the daily brutality to the economic exploitation, required individual people to make specific decisions that perpetuated suffering. Yet we've also seen how these systems create conditions that make moral choice extremely difficult. The Roman galley slave who became an informant, the overseer who delivered brutal punishments, the investor who funded slave operations, all were operating within structures that used to lead. We are Rubikins that severely limited their options and heavily influenced their decisions. This doesn't excuse individual moral failures, but it does highlight how systematic oppression works partly by compromising the moral agency of everyone it touches. Understanding this dynamic is crucial for recognizing and resisting similar systems. In our own time, the question of progress, Roman galley slavery forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about progress and civilization. The same society that produced magnificent art, sophisticated engineering, And complex legal systems also created and maintained one of history's most efficient systems of human destruction. This contradiction suggests that technological and cultural progress don't automatically lead to moral progress. Societies can become more sophisticated in their capacity for both creation and destruction simultaneously. The tools and techniques that enable great achievements can often be applied with equal effectiveness to great evils. The Roman experience also demonstrates that systems of oppression can be maintained by people who see themselves as civilized and moral. The Romans didn't see themselves as evil, but as bringing order and prosperity to the world. Their capacity for systematic cruelty coexisted with genuine achievements in law, engineering, and governance. Final thoughts as you drift off to sleep tonight. Perhaps these stories of ancient suffering can serve as a reminder of both human resilience and human vulnerability. The men who died chained to Roman galley benches were not different from us in any fundamental way. They had hopes, fears, relationships, and dreams that were systematically destroyed by a civilization that valued efficiency over humanity. Their suffering was not meaningless if we can learn from it. The Roman system of galley slavery provides a clear example of how ordinary people can create and maintain extraordinary evil through the accumulation of small compromises, bureaucratic procedures, and economic incentives. Understanding this history doesn't provide easy answers to contemporary moral challenges, but it does offer crucial insights into how systems of oppression function and persist. It reminds us that vigilance against systematic cruelty is a constant requirement of civilized life, not a problem that can be solved once and forgotten. The oars have been silent for over 1,000 years. The drums have stopped beating. The chains have rusted away. But the lessons remain, waiting for us to learn them and apply them to the moral challenges of our own time. Sleep well, knowing that the greatest tribute we can pay to those who suffered in the galleys is to remain awake to the systems of oppression that persist in our own world, and to resist them with the same stubborn courage that kept hope alive even in the darkest depths of Roman ships.